The Last Walk, Chapter 1. It was Christmas Eve in Modesto. The streets were still and the sky hung gray. In the houses, families were wrapping gifts and cooking meals. The smell of pine and turkey and cinnamon drifted from door to door. At the Peterson house, the dog was in the yard. The leash dragged in the dirt. The gate was open. Inside, the lights were on, but the rooms were empty. No one was in the kitchen. No one was on the couch. The television murmured to itself. By afternoon, the neighbors had noticed. The dog walked the block, leash dangling, as if it had been searching for someone who never came. People wondered why. People whispered. That morning, Lacey Peterson had been seen walking the dog. She was 8 months pregnant. She had smiled at the neighbors. She had waved at the mailman. She looked like a woman ready for Christmas, ready for birth, ready for life. But when night came, she was gone. Her husband said he had gone fishing. He said he had left before lunch and returned after dark. He said he had parked his boat in the bay and cast a line in the cold water. He said when he came home, she was missing. At first there was confusion. Perhaps she had gone shopping. Perhaps she had gone to visit her mother. But phones rang and no one answered. Hours passed. The family grew restless. By evening, the calls reached the police. A woman was missing. She was young, beautiful, about to be a mother. She had vanished from her home without a trace. The town stirred. Officers searched the streets, the parks, the alleys. Volunteers lit candles and carried flyers. They pinned her face to telephone poles. They taped her name on storefront windows. The story was out now. It moved fast. Reporters came with cameras. Trucks parked on corners. Men shouted questions into the night. Every screen showed the same smile, the same young face, the same eyes that now stared at the world with silence. America was watching.
Chapter 2. The house stood quiet after Christmas. The lights were still strung along the roofline, their small bulbs unlit in the early morning. Inside, wrapping paper lay crumpled on the floor, the smell of pine needles sharp in the living room. It should have been a time of warmth. Instead, the walls held silence, and silence is a heavy thing. Lacey Peterson was missing. That word moved through Modesto like a cold wind. Missing. A wife, 8 months pregnant, vanished without a sound. Scott told the story many times that day. He said he had gone on fishing, said he had driven down to the Berkeley Marina, said when he came back, the house was empty. The dog was still in the yard with its leash dragging, the front door unlocked. His wife, gone. Neighbors gathered in small knots on the street. They spoke in low voices, the way people do when fear is close but not yet named. Some remembered seeing Lacey walking the dog that morning. Others weren't sure. Memory is a fragile thing, and fear makes it weaker. The police came. They moved through the rooms quiet and steady. They asked questions, took notes, looked at the half-packed gift bag still on the table. They studied the small signs of life interrupted, the curling iron on the counter, the folded laundry on the bed. Lacey had been preparing for Christmas morning, and now she was gone. By evening, the story was larger than Modesto. The news trucks came with their cameras, their satellite dishes, their questions. Reporters stood on the curb with bright lights shining into the night. A woman with a microphone asked, "How can a pregnant wife simply vanish?" Scott appeared before them, his voice measured, his face stiff. He said he wanted his wife home. He hoped she was safe. But in his eyes there was something else, something people would remember later, a distance, a coolness. The search began at dawn the next day. Volunteers came in hundreds. They combed the fields, the orchards, the canals. They carried flashlights and hope, though hope is not light enough to see through darkness. Boats searched the waters of the delta. Dogs sniffed along the levees.
Flyers were taped to windows and pinned to telephone poles. Lacey's smile looked out from every corner of town. Christmas passed with the sound of helicopters overhead. Strangers lit candles in their windows. Modesto was no longer a quiet town. It had become the center of a story, and the story was heavy. The husband remained calm. Too calm, some said. He spoke without tears. He walked without weight. When a man's wife is gone, people expect storm, not stillness, and in that stillness, doubt began to grow. Yet no one could say for sure. There was no body, no blood, no proof, only the ache of absence and the shadow of suspicion. The river kept its secrets, the fields held their silence, and the town waited, caught between hope and dread.
Chapter 3. Rain fell on Modesto in the first week of January. It slicked the streets, pooled in the gutters, and made the searchers' boots heavy with mud. But they kept going. They looked in orchards, in fields, in barns, in ditches. They carried poles to push through the reeds, ropes to lower into culverts. Every day more came. Friends, neighbors, strangers who had only seen Lacey's face on the evening news. The flyers spread farther now, beyond Modesto, into San Francisco, Sacramento, Los Angeles. Her smile was on gas station windows and supermarket doors. A young woman, 8 months pregnant, missing on Christmas Eve. It was a story that carried weight. Inside the Peterson home, the air was close and tight. Cameras waited outside. Reporters spoke into microphones as the red lights blinked. Scott kept his voice even. He asked for privacy. He asked for prayers. He asked for Lacey to come home. But questions grew. Why go fishing on Christmas Eve? Why drive 2 hours to the bay when his wife was due to give birth within weeks? Why return with an alibi that bent under the smallest weight? The detectives listened. They watched. They followed Scott Peterson's movements. His words did not change, but his eyes told something else. They searched his truck, his boat, his warehouse. They noted small things, details that a man in grief might not hide, but a man in guilt might forget. Lacey's family stood by him at first. They embraced him at press conferences. They said they believed him. But even love can shift under pressure. When weeks passed and no trace was found, doubt seeped in like rain through a crack in the roof. The town carried the ache. Mothers held their children tighter. Wives looked at their husbands with new eyes. Husbands wondered if their silence would be mistaken for distance. On the 4th week, detectives asked Scott if he would take a polygraph. He declined. He said it would not help find his wife. But the refusal whispered louder than his words. At night, the bay rolled under the dark sky. The tide moved in and out. Cold, endless, patient. Somewhere in those waters, secrets waited. And the longer they waited, the heavier they became.
Chapter 4. The 4th week bled into the 5th. The flyers had begun to curl at the edges. Rain streaked and sun faded, but they still hung on walls and windows. The news trucks still idled near the Peterson house, their cameras pointed at the door like rifles waiting for movement. Scott Peterson went about his days with a kind of calm that unsettled people. He answered questions with a flat tone, kept his face even, and did not tremble when he spoke her name. Some said it was strength. Others said it was the mask of a man with something to hide. Detectives began to see the cracks. Scott told them he had gone fishing at the Berkeley Marina. He named the place, showed them the route, pointed to a small aluminum boat. It was an odd choice, they thought. Christmas Eve. A wife, heavily pregnant, left at home. A man driving 2 hours to fish in winter waters where no fish swam. The marina became a place of scrutiny. Officers walked the docks. They spoke with attendants who remembered a man alone hauling a small boat into the water. The tide that day had been swift and cold. It did not carry fish, it carried silence. Then came the first real break. A woman named Amber Frey stepped forward. She was from Fresno, a massage therapist. Blonde hair, quiet voice. She told detectives she had been seeing Scott. He had told her he was single, no wife, no child on the way, nothing but a future together. When the news broke, it hit Modesto like a hammer. Lacey's face had become the symbol of innocence, of family, of loss. Now the man pleading for her return was revealed as a liar, living a second life while his wife's family searched orchards and rivers. Amber did not hold back. She spoke plainly. She told of dinners, of calls, of promises, of how Scott had said only weeks before that he would spend the holidays with her as a widower. The words chilled even hardened detectives. The story spread beyond California now. National anchors spoke her name. Talk shows speculated. Strangers debated his guilt over coffee and newspapers. The affair became the stain that no statement could wash away. At the Peterson home, Lacey's mother wept on camera. Her voice cracked as she said she no longer knew the man she had once called her son. The family's faith in Scott crumbled in front of the nation. And through it all, Scott remained composed. He said the affair had nothing to do with Lacey's disappearance. He said he wanted her found. He said the press twisted his life into something it was not. But in the detective's eyes, the picture had changed. A man with a wife gone. A man with a mistress waiting. A man whose alibi sat on dark water 2 hours from home. The bay grew heavier with suspicion. The search widened. Dogs were brought to the shoreline. Boats cut across the waves. Helicopters traced the coast. Every eye turned to the dark water, as if the tide itself might confess. The truth was out there, hidden in the pull of the current, waiting for the day it would rise.
Chapter 5. The new year came to Modesto heavy and gray. The Christmas lights still clung to houses, sagging, dimmed. On the Peterson lawn, the wreaths and ribbons looked like relics of a holiday that had never arrived. The search for Lacey did not end with the turn of the calendar. Volunteers still came. They carried maps and flashlights. They combed the riverbanks, the orchards, the back roads that cut through farmland. They returned each night, cold, tired, and empty-handed. Reporters no longer stood at a distance. They pressed in close. They followed Scott to the grocery store, to his truck, to the front door. Microphones caught his every breath. The cameras captured his steady gaze, his easy smile. To the public, that calm no longer looked like strength. It looked like indifference. Detectives leaned on him harder now. They circled back to his timeline, asked the same questions again. Where did he launch? What time did he leave? What did he do between the morning and the afternoon? His answers never changed, but his tone grew sharper, the patience thinner. Amber Frey became the figure the media craved. She stepped into the glare with steady resolve. She gave interviews, spoke of deception, of promises that turned to lies. She said she came forward because Lacey and her child deserved truth. America watched her and believed her. The walls around Scott closed tighter. Friends who once shook his hand now turned away. Neighbors who had baked casseroles for the search now whispered behind curtains. Even in the grocery store, he could feel it, the weight of eyes, the hush of voices saying, "Murderer, murderer, murderer." Yet the law had no body, no weapon, only suspicion, only circumstance.
The bay held its secrets, and until it spoke, the case was a shadow without shape. Still, the tide shifted. Reporters spoke not of a missing woman, but of a man who fished where no fish swam. A man who lied to his mistress, a man who carried a calm that seemed colder with each passing day. On January nights, the wind came off the fields sharp and bitter. The Peterson house stood quiet, its windows dark. Inside, Scott moved from room to room, the silence pressing down like stone. Lacey's clothes hung in the closet. Her scent lingered. The nursery stood ready, untouched. The crib waited, the rocking chair waited. The child who would never come waited only in the minds of those who still prayed for a miracle. But outside, in the currents of the bay, something was shifting. The water that had held its silence would not hold it forever.
Chapter 6. The winter storms came hard over San Francisco Bay. Wind ripped across the water and the tide swelled higher than the seawalls. For weeks, the search boats had gone out and returned with nothing but salt spray and silence. The bay gave nothing back. It swallowed whole and kept its secrets. But secrets do not stay forever. It was April now, Easter week. The rains had broken, and the air carried that strange mix of spring and decay. On the morning of April 13, a couple walked their dog along the shoreline in Richmond. The dog pulled ahead, nose low to the sand, and then froze. The couple followed, their eyes falling on something that did not belong. A body. Small, twisted. A child. They called police with voices that shook, the phone trembling in hand. Officers came. Tape went up. Reporters gathered. The scene was grim, unbearable. The remains of a baby boy, umbilical cord still attached, washed up by the tide. A life never lived, carried from the depths. The next day the bay gave again. This time, a torso. Bloated, broken, the skin marbled from weeks in the water. It had no head, no limbs. Only a body that once was whole. Detectives came quick. The coroner moved careful. But everyone standing there knew. They knew before the tests, before the records, before the comparisons. It was her. It was Lacey. News spread faster than sirens. Modesto heard it by noon. By night, the whole country knew. Missing no more. Dead. Found at last. The mood of the town changed in an instant. Grief gave way to fury. Candles burned on porches not for hope, but for justice. People spoke her name with tears and spoke his name with anger. Scott. In the police station, detectives closed their circle. They had waited for this. They had held their patience. Now they had what they needed. Not just suspicion, not just a mistress, not just odd calm and lies. They had her body. They had the child who would never breathe. The bay had kept its silence for months, but now it had spoken. And it spoke only one thing: murder.
Chapter 7. The morning of April 18 broke clear and sharp. The air smelled of cut grass and damp asphalt. In the Modesto, officers moved quietly, phones pressed to their ears, radios turned low. The word had gone out the night before. It was time. They had waited long enough. Months of watching, of tapping phones, of following his car through quiet streets. They had watched him buy beer, rent movies, make calls he thought no one heard. They knew where he slept, where he drove, who he spoke to. And they knew one thing with certainty: he was running. Scott Peterson had grown restless. His eyes shifted when he walked. His truck was always packed, clothes, cash, camping gear, the kind of things you carried not for a drive across town, but for a drive that never stopped. That morning, detectives trailed him down Highway 101. He headed south, toward San Diego, toward the border. His car hugged the lanes, steady but nervous. He looked in his mirrors more than most. He knew the walls were closing. Unmarked units followed 2 cars back. Another slid in ahead. A helicopter kept its distance, circling wide in the sky. The call came through the radio. Move! They closed fast. Lights flashed red and blue. Sirens tore open the calm morning. The truck veered, slowed, then pulled to the shoulder. Dust rose up in a cloud. Officers were out of their cars in an instant, guns drawn, voices loud and hard. Hands in the air, step out of the vehicle. Scott opened the door slow, as if buying himself one last moment of freedom. He stepped out, wearing sunglasses, his hair dyed a weak shade of blonde. He looked thinner, older, a man already fading. They cuffed him against the hood of his truck. The metal clicked shut on his wrists, final and cold. He did not fight. He did not shout. He only asked, in a voice flat and even, "What is this about?" But they knew he knew. Everyone knew. The search of his truck told the rest of the story. Inside, nearly $15,000 in cash, maps of Mexico, camping supplies, multiple cell phones, his brother's identification. It was not the luggage of a grieving husband. It was the luggage of a man who planned to vanish. By noon, the news broke. Cameras rolled as Scott Peterson was led into jail, head down, hands bound. Reporters shouted questions, flashes lit the air. The town that once pitied him now spat his name. The trial would come later, the verdict too, but the moment of truth had already passed. On the side of a California highway, under a wide, clear sky, Scott Peterson's freedom ended.
Chapter 8. The courthouse in Redwood City smelled of varnish and paper. Polished wood, stiff benches, the murmur of too many people forced into one room. Reporters filled every seat, their pens ready, cameras waiting outside in the heat. This was not just a trial. It was a spectacle. Scott Peterson walked in wearing a suit that hung loose on him. His face looked calm, but his eyes betrayed him. He glanced at the jury, then at the floor, then back again, always moving, never steady. The weight of every look pressed on him. The judge called for silence. The gavel cracked. The trial of Scott Peterson had begun. The prosecution opened strong. A woman stood before the jury, her voice clear, her words sharp as glass. She spoke of Lacey, of her last walk on Christmas Eve. She spoke of a life waiting to be born, of a family that would never see daylight. She did not raise her voice, but every sentence cut deep. She pointed to Scott and said, "He did this." Jurors leaned forward, reporters scribbled, the room grew heavy. When the defense took the floor, the air shifted. His lawyer was smooth, polished, a man who understood how to bend doubt into a shield. He told the jury this was a tragedy, yes, but not a crime. He painted Scott as a husband trapped in grief, a man broken by loss and hunted by rumor. The words rolled like smoke, soft and practiced. The jury listened. Some nodded. Some did not. Evidence came next. Photos of the bay, charts of currents, the bones found near the shore. Lacey, The unborn child. Silent images that spoke louder than any witness. Each one placed before the jury, slow and deliberate, like stones laid on a grave. The room stayed quiet. Even the reporter stopped writing for a moment. Witnesses stepped up. Neighbors, friends, detectives who had followed Scott's every move, a boat seller who recalled the purchase, the mistress who spoke of secret calls, of promises made in the dark. Each voice built the story higher until the weight of it filled the room. Scott sat at the defense table, writing on a yellow pad, passing notes to his lawyer, sometimes smiling, sometimes frowning, but never breaking, never showing more than a flicker. The trial stretched for weeks, each day a battle. The prosecution drove their knife deeper. The defense parried with doubt, with shadows, with what-ifs. The jury sat in the middle, silent, taking in every word, every gesture, every breath. And outside, the crowd grew larger. People lined the sidewalks, holding signs, chanting, waiting for scraps of news. The story had left Modesto and spread to every corner of America. Scott Peterson was no longer just a man on trial. He was a symbol of betrayal, of murder, of the darkness that hides behind closed doors. Inside the courtroom, the fight pressed on. One side argued for justice, the other for doubt. And every day the question remained, whispered in homes and shouted on talk shows, did he do it? The answer waited at the end, but no one, not even the jury, knew what it would be. Not yet.
Chapter 9. Amber Frey stepped into the courtroom like someone walking through fire. She wore a simple suit, her hair pulled back, her face pale. Reporters shifted forward, pens ready. The jury straightened in their seats. Everyone in the room knew this moment mattered. She raised her right hand, swore the oath, and took her place in the witness chair. For a moment, the silence was heavy, the air thick. Then the prosecutor began. Amber spoke softly, her voice steady but carrying weight. She told the jury how she had met Scott, how he had looked at her with eyes that seemed honest, how his words had been smooth, easy. He had told her he was single. He had told her he wanted something real. She paused, breathed, and then said the words that shook the room. He told me his wife was gone. He told me this was his first Christmas without her. Gasps moved across the gallery. The jurors froze. Scott sat at the defense table, his eyes low, his face unreadable. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering, but Scott did not move. Amber went on. She spoke of dinners, of calls late into the night, of promises whispered like secrets. And then she told them about the moment she learned the truth. She saw the news. She saw Lacey's face. She realized the man she had trusted was living a lie. Her voice cracked only once. She lifted her chin quickly, forcing herself steady. She looked at the jury and said, "I never would have been with him if I had known." The prosecutor guided her through the calls recorded by police, tapes played in the courtroom, Scott's voice filling the air. He spoke to Amber as if nothing had happened, as if Lacey had never existed. Smooth, calm, careful words. Not the voice of a grieving husband, but of a man managing two lives. The jurors listened closely, their faces hard. Some turned their eyes toward Scott. When the defense cross-examined, the questions came sharp, trying to twist her words, to paint her as reckless, as someone seeking attention, but Amber held firm. She repeated her answers, clear, steady. No, she had not lied. No, she had not wanted the spotlight. She only wanted the truth known. By the time she stepped down, the room felt different, heavy, darker, as if her words had pulled the curtain back on Scott's private world. The prosecutor closed the day with quiet force. She turned to the jury and said,
A man who lies about his wife being dead while she is missing is not a man grieving. He is a man covering his tracks. The gavel struck. The court adjourned. Reporters rushed outside to send their stories. The crowd outside roared with fresh voices, new anger. And inside, Scott Peterson sat still, staring at the table, his hands folded tight. The trial had shifted. Everyone could feel it.
Chapter 10. The bay lay flat and gray under the winter sky. Cold wind moved across the water, carrying the smell of salt and oil. Reporters gathered along the shore when police towed Scott Peterson's small aluminum boat out of storage. Cameras clicked. The jurors would not come here, but the image was burned into the minds of everyone watching. A man alone in a boat, a pregnant wife missing. In court, the prosecution built the scene piece by piece. They wheeled the boat into the courtroom itself. The jurors leaned forward. The aluminum hull gleamed under the harsh lights. It looked ordinary, almost fragile, yet it carried the weight of suspicion heavier than iron. The prosecutor walked around it slowly. "This," she said, "is where Lacey Peterson's life ended." The words echoed. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably, their hands tight in their laps. Scott sat still, but his jaw worked. Police divers testified about the currents of San Francisco Bay. They described how the tides could take a body, moving it for miles, breaking it down, scattering it. They spoke of the anchors, simple concrete molds that Scott had made in his workshop. Only one was found. The rest, they said, were gone, likely resting on the floor of the bay. Experts explained how a body weighted with anchors would sink and vanish in the dark water, hidden until the sea gave it back, and the sea had. Months later, Lacey's remains washed ashore, along with the unborn child she had carried. The jurors heard it all in silence. The prosecutor pointed to the fishing trip Scott had described on Christmas Eve. No one had seen him fish. He had no bait, no catch, nothing to show for the trip, but he had the boat, the anchors, and the time. Then came the maps, large charts of the bay spread across the courtroom. Investigators marked the spots Scott had visited that day. They drew lines with steady hands, showing how his story matched too closely with where the bodies had been found. The defense objected, argued, pushed back. They said there was no proof, only guesses. They said anyone could have harmed Lacey and dumped her in the bay. They said the evidence was built on assumptions and fear. But the image of the boat stayed. A small craft, a man alone, the wide mouth of the bay swallowing secrets. The jurors did not speak, but their eyes followed the prosecutor as she rested her hand on the gunwale of the boat. She said nothing. She did not need to. The silence carried more weight than words. When the court recessed that day, the gallery buzzed. Reporters sent headlines racing across the country, and outside, strangers whispered to each other about the boat, about the anchors, about the water that had hidden the truth. For the first time, the case no longer felt like theory. It felt like the shape of a crime laid bare.
Chapter 11. The tide rolled in quiet that morning. A man walking his dog along the shore near Richmond stopped when the animal pulled hard at the leash. The sand was wet, littered with driftwood and bottles. Among it lay something small, fragile, and terrible. It was the body of a child, born too soon, the skin gray and torn by the sea. The man froze. His dog whined. He called the police with shaking hands. The next day, not far down the same shore, another body surfaced. This one was larger. A woman, her frame broken, her skin battered by months in the water. Her hair clung in strands to the skull. Her clothes were torn. She was unrecognizable at first, but the gold necklace around her neck told the truth. Lacey. News broke fast. Cameras swarmed the shoreline. Helicopters circled.
The story that had filled headlines for months now had its answer, brought in by the tide. At the courthouse, reporters shouted questions at Scott as he walked past. He did not look at them. His face was calm, too calm, but his jaw clenched tight enough to tremble. For the jurors, the news came as a shock. They had been told again and again about theories, about anchors, about the bay. Now the sea had spoken. The bodies were there. The bodies had come home. Prosecutors told the jury that this was no coincidence. The places where Scott had said he fished lined up with where the tide had carried Lacey and her unborn son. They said this was the proof, the final link. In the gallery, Sharon Rocha, Lacey's mother, wept openly. Her cries broke the silence of the courtroom. She held her hands over her face, her shoulders shaking. Her family clung to her, all of them breaking under the weight of what had been found. Some jurors could not meet her eyes. Others stared at Scott, waiting for something, anything in his face. But he gave them nothing. He sat still, as though carved from stone. The defense tried to fight back. They said the bay was vast. They said bodies drifted, that anyone could have used that water to hide a crime. They said the evidence was not science, but coincidence. But the sea had returned Lacey, and with her, the child she had carried. That image, the mother and child, both brought back by the tide, was too much to argue away. It lodged in the minds of the jurors and did not leave. At night, when the jurors went home, they carried that image with them. A woman and her unborn son left in the water by someone who should have loved them. The trial was no longer only about suspicion. It was about bodies found on a shore and a bay that had given back its dead.
Chapter 12. The Verdict. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that makes the air heavy. The jury filed in. Their faces were blank, drained from days of thought. Scott sat at the table, hands folded, eyes low. His lawyer whispered something, but he did not answer. He stared at the wood grain of the desk as if it were the last thing he could control. The judge asked the question. The foreman stood. His voice was steady. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of second-degree murder of the unborn child. The words cut through the still air. Gasps rose from the benches. Some wept, some whispered, some sat frozen. Sharon Rocha, Lacey's mother, lowered her face into her hands and cried. The sound was raw, unbroken. Scott did not move. He blinked once, slowly. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His lawyer put a hand on his arm. He shook it off. The judge thanked the jury. The gavel struck. It was over. Outside, cameras waited. Reporters shouted questions. The crowd pressed forward, some calling for justice, others muttering curses. Police held them back. The news rolled live, the nation watching. Inside, the family clung to each other. They spoke Lacey's name. They held her memory close, as if the verdict had brought her back for a moment. Scott was led away in chains. The clink of metal echoed down the corridor. He kept his head down. His last walk as a free man had ended the day he was arrested. Now every step was owned by the state. The sentence would come later. Death row. But in that moment, it was the verdict that mattered. The truth, spoken aloud, had broken the silence. Chapter 13. The Weight of Memory. The years passed. The case lived on in headlines, in documentaries, in late-night conversations in quiet towns far from California. The name Lacey Peterson became more than a name. It became a story, a warning, a ghost. Her family carried her in photographs, in laughter remembered, in tears that came without warning. They spoke of her smile, of her kindness, of the life that had been waiting for her. They remembered the Christmas morning she never saw. Scott sat in San Quentin. The walls were gray. The bars did not move. His days were measured in silence and in the sound of footsteps in the hall. He kept few visitors. Letters came, some of them cruel, some of them strange. He read them all, then folded them away. The world moved on, but the case never truly ended. Each anniversary brought news crews back to Modesto. Each documentary stirred the questions again. Was justice served? Was the truth told? But beyond the noise, there was only the absence, the empty chair at the table, the child never born, the young woman who went for a walk and never came home. And so the story lived, not in the court records or the news archives, but in the quiet moments, in the memory of a mother holding her daughter's photograph, in the eyes of a sister staring at the horizon, in the hush that falls when someone says her name. Lacey. The last walk she ever took was through her neighborhood on a December morning. The last walk Scott ever took was into a courtroom where the world waited for him to fall. One walk ended a life. The other ended a freedom. And both left behind a story America would never forget.